This video is all about drawing male torsos. We'll start with very simple chest and pelvis forms, and then break down some divisions and simple block-in shapes, and then take our blocked-in anatomical forms and start to move them around in space in a wide variety of poses. Finally, we'll do some simple shadowing, and be sure to stay tuned to the end where I break down my very simple method for drawing stomach anatomy. I'm David Finch. I've been a comic book artist for over 25 years. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe, and be sure to share with your friends. If you have any comments or suggestions for future videos, leave them below, and check out the description below for a list of tools that I use. Be sure to visit my website at davidfinchart.com, where you can find my Drawing Superhero Heads course and some great free drawing resources. All right, in this first section, we're going to draw some very simple examples of a chest and pelvis shape for a male torso. For my chest, I'm going much broader and shorter with it in proportion to the female chest that I drew in an earlier video. And that's because a male chest is just broader. It's not shorter, but in practice, it ends up being much shorter than the female torso just because it's broader. I'm drawing in my pelvis and drawing in my landmark bones for my pelvic bones for where my legs attach, and then attaching my legs below that. Drawing in balls for my shoulders, just a very simple form just to get my placement. And now I'm going to draw the same forms just from the side. My vest shape, and then my underwear shape essentially for my pelvis, my landmark bone. Now the same shape from the back. And I'm drawing through, from the back, you're actually seeing basically the spinal column drawn through. And you can see that all the same shapes apply. In drawing any anatomy, having a good understanding of these basic shapes is really vital to being able to draw solid figures that are consistent from figure to figure. And note, I'm drawing the spine up through the neck from the back view and just drawing the neck in from each view. And I'm drawing again the spine up through on the side view, and the back of the neck attaches through to the spine from the back. Now I'm just going to draw one more view, and this is just going to be looking down at the torso from above. And so you can see where the head attaches in the center of the vest shape at the top. My pelvis drawn underneath, and drawing a center line down keeps everything well lined up. And drawing my landmark bones is a really good way for me to get my legs attached properly. Drawing ball shapes in from my shoulders, and drawing a tube from my neck, extending up from where I've got the circle defined for the base of the neck. Now that we have that done, I'm going to go ahead and draw a more detailed figure. And so I've already drawn in basically the same thing that we saw just a moment ago. And so I'm skipping ahead to where I start to actually define in my anatomical shapes. And these are going to be very, very simplified shapes. I'm drawing in on top of my ball shape for the shoulder, a more accurate representation of the deltoid muscle, defining in the shape for my pectorals and my rib cage below that. The arms attach underneath the deltoids, and drawing my center line down through the stomach. I'm drawing also lines down the center of each pectoral down through the stomach. It defines where my stomach goes, and it's a great way to define the outlines of the stomach and make sure that everything lines up. And you'll notice as I draw the line down the left side of the body that it's making it clear to me that my pectoral on that side of the body is not extending out far enough. And it's why drawing in these kinds of guidelines can be so useful, because it very quickly isolates any proportional problems that you have. Just cleaning things up a little bit, making sure that it's all clear. And now I'm just redefining in my rib cage and getting my stomach actually defined in. And I do it in a very mechanical kind of a way. You can see that it's basically like broadened triangles attaching to each other, attaching in my obliques, extending into the serratus, and just giving a little bit of dimension to my pectoral muscles along the bottom there. I generally keep my pectorals fairly flattened to the body and not extending too far out. I just find that it looks aesthetically a little bit better. So attaching my neck up to my ears and just quickly drawing in a head. And now with my head placed in, I can finish out my shoulder construction connecting up to the head. Just redefining in my collarbone placement and getting everything lined up well. And now I'm just defining in a pelvic shape just underneath my bones and attaching in my legs. And you'll notice the legs always attach in the way that they're supposed to, just based on the bones that I extend out below the pelvis. Now that we have that defined in, I'm going to go ahead and start to draw in a back, drawing in my vest shape. The hole for the neck actually really wouldn't be visible from this angle, it's angled to the front, but I'm drawing through just to make sure that it's clear that it's there. Drawing through my spine, getting the head attached to the top of the neck, cleaning it up a little bit, making sure the ear is placed properly. Drawing in my balls for my shoulders, extending the spine down to the pelvis, and drawing in my pelvic shape. On my Drawing Female Torsos video, I actually used a doll as reference to help with drawing the pelvic shape, and if that's something you find useful, I'd definitely recommend doing it here too. Attaching in my arms below the shoulders, and now that I've got that defined in fairly well, I'm going to go ahead and create some divisions for the back just to give me some good landmarks and make sure that everything lines up properly. Lighten it down, and I'm going to start to draw in my very, very simplified back anatomy. I find backs can be incredibly difficult to draw well, and knowing the anatomy for the back is really kind of only step one, just because there's so much movement in the back and so much layering of muscle. I find having a really simplified anatomy for the back just to get placement is the best way to go. And then in all honesty, I use reference to draw backs, but I use my simplified anatomical breakdown to make sure that what I'm drawing is all placed properly on the figure and everything makes sense, so I don't get lost in small details. So I definitely recommend that you approach backs this way. Over my years of drawing, I've gotten to the point where I can draw backs from a few angles in a few lighting situations that can be pretty convincing without reference, but generally speaking, I find reference to be very, very helpful. So I use a simplified form like this just to make sure that when I'm using reference, I don't get lost in detail and I have something that works for the overall body. And so now just quickly, I'm drawing in my shoulder blades, and you'll see that they actually extend underneath other muscles, and they have quite a bit of influence over the final look of the anatomy, and this is why reference can be so incredibly helpful for drawing backs. There's just so much interplay of muscles that it's very difficult to fake. Now in this next example, I'm drawing an arm extended, and you can see that I've got my chest lifted and extended up to the shoulder, and then my lats actually extend and attach to the bottom of the arm and inside the bottom of the deltoid. I'm drawing in my other arm also extended, and I'm erasing out my pectoral there and then flattening it and extending it to my deltoid on that side. When you lift your arms, it really flattens out your pectoral muscles, and that's something to be aware of. They narrow and they flatten. In this next example, we're going to cover the deltoid and chest connection in a very, very simplified way. It can be very easy to kind of get lost in how all of those muscles connect together and make them work together. And so what I found works for me is I connect my chest all the way from the bottom of my deltoid where it attaches to the arm. And as I go down the chest, there's a break point. The muscles actually connect to the inside of the deltoid at the top of the arm right here. And so the striations of the chest radiate out from that connection point out toward the center of the chest and then toward the bottom. And now lifting the arm, you can see I've got the arm defined as a simple tube with my deltoid drawn above it, and then all of my pectoral muscles attached to the inside of that deltoid, and my striations radiate out from that point. And also my lat connects to the underside of that tube. And so now that we have those simple forms defined, I'm going to use those forms to draw a few figures in motion. And for this first figure, I've got the arms extended over the head. And so I'm connecting up my chest to my arm, and notice that I've got my arm lifted quite a bit. When you lift your arms, your whole shoulder girdle also lifts. And so if you extend the arm out from where it would rest naturally, if it's relaxed downward, you'll end up with an arm that's extending from too low in the chest. So when you raise your arms, you really need to raise that entire girdle and raise the level of your collarbone. So your collarbone stays stationary in the center and it raises up toward the arm. The entire arm assembly lifts quite a bit. So I'm attaching in my stomach, getting in my rib cage, and then attaching in my lats directly below that arm. And you can see the underside of the deltoid. Just cleaning things up a little bit, make it just a little bit more clear how everything's attaching in there. Getting in my serratus. And just quickly defining in my other raised arm. And now in this next example, I'm going to extend the arm across the body in front. And this is a very common pose to run into, especially if you have a character punching. And so defining in my chest, my pelvis, got the arm kind of defined in. It's not really lifted that high in this example. And so the arm is extending from just a little bit lower in the chest because I don't have the arm extended up above the body. And drawing in my lats and my shoulder girdle, my serratus, and then using the landmark divisions that I drew down along the body, I'm drawing in my stomach, and my obliques, defining in the other arm. And when it comes to drawing dynamic figures in motion, it's very important to understand how your lats actually attach under the arm, because it's something that you'll run into all the time. Next, I want to show an example that I've seen a few times, and I think it can be very, very helpful for turning and moving bodies in space. That's essentially defining the body like a sack that you can twist and maneuver in space. Now that I've got that in, I'm drawing in my formal shapes on top of it, my pelvis, my chest shape. Now that I've got that in, I'm drawing in my formal divisions, my chest shape, my pelvis shape, my landmark bones for the hips, drawing in legs from that. And you can see that I've got a twist in that. I've got a twist from my chest shape down through my pelvic shape that I got very easily just by drawing a simple sack shape in that I just gave a bit of a twist to, and then allowing my detail to follow that form. In this next example, I've got the sack almost like it's laying on the floor and propped up against a wall. And so I can define my chest shape, my pelvic shape on that, get my landmark bone shapes for my hips, draw in some balls for my shoulders, and I'm just drawing in the same shapes that I was drawing earlier and just using that sack as a placement in space. Drawing in some legs, some arms extended from it, giving it a head. I think proportionally my chest and pelvic area is a little small in this figure, so it's just something to be aware of. I find when I'm doing these kinds of examples, I'm worrying so much about defining the shapes in that I sometimes lose proportion just a little bit. But really, I feel like it emphasizes why drawing these kinds of anatomical breakdowns can be so useful, because it's very easy to see when things get a little bit out of proportion, and you can fix them quickly before you start to draw in all of your detail. Got a center line, and I've just drawn my stomach along that center line, rounding around the form that I initially drew just with my simple sack shape. You can see how quickly and easily I can get all of my anatomical forms blocked in on that very, very simple sack shape. This is a method I find incredibly useful for me. This is a method that I really enjoy using. I find it really effective for me using volumetric shapes as opposed to a stick figure, but obviously your results will vary. I definitely recommend that you give this a try, even if you are more comfortable drawing stick figures as your basis. And so we're going to draw one more example using my simple sack shape. In this one, I've got it curved outward, so the back is arched, and I'm drawing my chest and pelvic shape on top of it, getting them defined in, holes for the shoulders, drawing a line down through where my stomach goes, my landmark bones. It's very, very quick to get everything defined on top of that shape, which is why I like using it so much, and just finishing out some legs quickly, because leg placement in the pelvic girdle is so important. You can see how easy it is to do when you have your landmarks defined properly. Drawing in my neck and my head. I've got both arms extended well up above. So now I'm going to go ahead and attach my pectorals to my deltoid muscles, making sure that they extend upward and connect properly. My chest is very flat to my rib cage because it's lifted and extended. And defining in my stomach along my guidelines. My lats inserted in under the arm, and just quickly getting all of my basic shapes defined in. You can see how quickly you can get everything defined in just using simple landmarks and connections. Now in this next example, I wanted to cover some very simple lighting. So I'm sketching in my figure, moving ahead quickly here because we've done this a few times now in this video. But now that I've got everything defined in, I've got this lit basically from the right side. I guess it would be the figure's left side. And using my very simple volumetric forms, it makes it really easy for me to just define in some simple lighting. I'm keeping all my lighting shapes very, very simple here, just for the sake of clarity. But just based on my guidelines, you can see where things turn away in space from the light. It makes it very easy to keep your shadows isolated to the parts that are away from the light. Drawing in some shadowing underneath my stomach anatomy, along my oblique. Hopefully these very simple examples show just how easy it is to get lighting defined in on figures if you think about things in broad, simple shapes. You can define in smaller details, and little striations, and little connection points, and you can go very, very far with that kind of detail, but it's really important to be able to break down your lighting into the most simple shapes possible to make sure that your overall pattern works. and then just finishing out some lighting on the arm just to make the figure a little bit more consistent. In this next figure, the entire reason why I included this is because I have a real tendency to draw the upper portion of my stomach completely in shadow. And I think it's a technique that really, really works because it really defines the plane change from my rib cage and down through my stomach. And so I wanted to draw this from the side. You can see where the stomach inserts downward and away from the light. And I've got it shadowed all the way through there. I'm going to draw a little shadow underneath my deltoid, adjust my proportions a little bit where I came off in my initial drawing. And really, examples like this are why I really recommend that when you're learning lighting, you stick with one light source, because it's very easy to see what forms are pointing up toward the light and what forms are pointing away, and then think of your lighting in terms of an overall broad form. Now, in this next example, we're going to do some lighting on a back, and I just wanted to change that arm quickly and lift it, just because it slightly changes the underlying anatomy, and I thought it'd be more helpful to draw the arms in a few different positions. And so I'm defining in my anatomy. I'm just blocking in my major shapes the way that I did earlier on, and drawing in my shoulder blade and defining in my deltoid. And you can see how when I draw the center muscles of my back, I've contoured in a way that it actually accommodates the other muscles that connect into it. And the same thing with my deltoid. The bottom of the deltoid is contoured so that it accepts the tricep underneath. Defining in the rest of my anatomy down through the pelvis. And now I'm going to go ahead and start doing some lighting. I'm actually using reference for this picture. And this is why I really recommend that you use reference when you're drawing backs, especially backs. I think it can be very useful for drawing all of your anatomy. I think it's a mistake to use reference to draw your figure initially, but finding reference that fits with the figure that you've already got drawn in is a great way to make your lighting much more believable. There's a subtlety to anatomical shapes and lighting that can be very, very difficult to fake on your own. And that's why I really recommend using reference, especially for things like backs. But notice how I'm making sure that while I'm using reference for this, I'm also using my underlying anatomy and making sure that everything fits on the anatomy that I've initially defined. When you're using reference without a good understructure, it's really easy to get disjointed and just lost in all the little details. The idea is to use your reference as an aid to make your anatomy and your lighting more believable, but not to let it take over and override your underlying figure. So just for the sake of clarity, I wanted to draw a very simplified diagram of the lighting that I used for the back that I just drew. And you can see that my vest shape curves under and my lighting's coming from the left just slightly. And so I'm lighting the overall shape from that angle. And even with no anatomical detail at all, you can get something that has a certain amount of believability just by having a consistent overall lighting scheme. Now, before we wrap this video up, I wanted to show just a quick trick on the way that I draw my stomach muscles. You can see that I'm drawing simple downward facing curves with diagonal lines coming up from them. They're very, very simple shapes. And now just giving it a little bit of simple lighting, even using those very simplified shapes, gives me something that actually looks like a very believable stomach. I'm just going to go ahead and define a little detail around them, a shadow for my rib cage. I'm going to connect some simple shapes for a serratus and an oblique on the other side. And with very, very simple shapes, I've got something that looks very believable as a stomach. And hopefully you can see how simple and effective that is as opposed to drawing the kinds of shapes that I've got here, which I've seen quite a bit from artists that are learning anatomy. And so once again, really quickly, a center line, very, very simple shapes on top of it, connect them up just a little bit. And that's all I need to do to define a stomach. All right, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a lot of work to define this one down into a few simple steps, and I would definitely be covering male torsos in more detail later on. Be sure to tune in Monday nights at 8 o'clock Eastern for our Monday Night Draw live stream, and I will see you in the next video.